welcome to Character Explorations, a podcast production of the Wendt Center for Character Education at the University of Dubuque. I'm Annalee Ward, the director of the Wendt Center. Our guest today is Christine Darr, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Dubuque. She is the author of the article, Courageous Compassion, Cultivating Virtue in a Complicated World. This article is available online at dbq.edu/Wendt/publications. That's dbq.edu/WENDT/publications. Welcome, Dr. Darr.
Thank you.
You wrote this article way back in 2015 for the journal issue, Character and Courageous Compassion, a time when the Syrian refugee crisis was in the news. Yet the issues have not disappeared. Could you give us a little background for that article and share with us perhaps the story that broke your heart as you started this essay?
Sure. Yeah, well, my background and my dissertation research is in virtue. And so I've been really interested in how humans learn through habit and through intentional cultivation of habits, how to be good in the world, both for themselves and in the communities in which they live. So I'm really interested in those kinds of questions. And also fascinated by kind of the global complexity of the world as it is now. And so, my research was in Aquinas primarily, and the kind of virtue that we might need to cultivate in Aquinas' time seems much different than what it would be now, thinking about particularly neighbors. And so when I was writing the article, the Syrian refugee crisis was particularly salient in the news, and this image of a boy lying on a beach face down kept kind of popping up everywhere. You just kept seeing it. And as I saw that image and learned more about the refugee crisis, it just got me thinking about, what are my responsibilities to these people all over the world?
And that's a question that I think most of us continue to ask. What should I be doing, or what can I do? That question comes out of your training, I'm sure, in virtue ethics. Could you tell us a little bit about what virtue ethics is?
Sure. So virtue ethics is an approach to ethical reflection that focuses less on rules that we ought to live by and more on thinking about yourself as an individual person and who I want to be and who I want to become, and what kind of community that could bring about flourishing, not only for myself, but also for everyone that's part of that community. So it's a little bit different than other kinds of ethical approaches in that way, where it's mainly focused on character and becoming a person of integrity and compassion.
You mentioned virtue ethics as applying to the particular and the universal. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So part of what I talk about in the article is how humans are, we have the capacity both for being drawn to particular things, but also being able to think about universal concepts. So I might want to be a just person, and justice in that sense is a universal concept. And that's great, but there are also particular circumstances that I'm living in. And so becoming a person of character or virtue means thinking about, what does justice look like in this particular instance? Because it doesn't always look the same or require the same sorts of actions.
Now, you've mentioned that you've studied this virtue ethics quite a bit, and virtue ethics is something that the center is very concerned with. It comes out of the Aristotelian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, there are 4 virtues that Aristotle focuses on. courage, prudence, justice, and temperance. Yet you've written an essay about compassion. How does compassion fit into those virtues? And what do you mean by it? Is it a virtue?
Okay, that's a great question. So one of the ways that Aristotle thought about virtue is, what does a person of practical wisdom, how do they navigate their lives in their particular communities? What would be required to flourish? And so kind of from that inspiration, I think it makes sense to talk about compassion in our current world. Right. So what does it mean to be a flourishing person who's living well in our society? And I would argue that compassion is required. And compassion I see as distinct from, so it's not simply an emotion, right? An emotion such as like pity might be similar, but compassion requires not only an emotional response to a particular situation, but also a desire to and the will to act on what you know to be good or what you identify to be good for the particular person that is experiencing suffering, right? So you observe a suffering person or situation or a situation of suffering and then consider what would be the best way to respond that I can help this person to flourish a little bit more.
Well, let's draw this out to that situation of Island, the little boy on the beach who died, or in general to the immigration crisis. I mean, it's going on, immigration, migration around the world, and this suffering. How do we relate compassion to that?
Yeah. So frequently in the article, I talk about how our particular situation, like in our world today, is so complex. It requires us to have a complex response. I think that it is good and virtuous to have this sort of response when we see suffering of that's horrible. I'm seeing another person in pain. I want to figure out what I can do to alleviate some of that suffering. But because it's not so simple it's one thing to see you suffering and being able to kind of one-on-one know how I could help you. And it's another thing to see someone across the world suffer and want to do something, which again, I think is an appropriate response, but not being sure what to do. So figuring out and doing the work of trying to understand what is going on politically and socially so that you can make an informed action is really important.
Thank you for that. That's just a good challenge for all of us, just to continue to stay involved in finding out the truth of stories of what's happening and finding out from more than one source. Well, another resource that you draw on is from the Christian tradition, is liberation theology. And why don't you talk a little bit about how that gives you some insights into thinking about compassion as a response to suffering?
So I find liberation theology to be a really helpful way of thinking about power and how power contributes to injustice. And so they've given us lots of tools for thinking about and analyzing our communities, understanding that things are, that there are power imbalances, and particularly within the Christian tradition, that Jesus expresses a desire for justice for all, not only Jesus, but the tradition itself, that there's such it's repetition in the biblical tradition of the significance and importance of justice. And so thinking about when I said earlier that we need to be able to analyze the social and political situation in order to know how to act responsibly and justly, part of that is analyzing the way that power is moving in a particular situation and how to give more power to those who are powerless.
Okay, so then when you think about that in relationship to immigration, as we look at that issue and we look at these people are powerless in many respects. That's why they're having to leave their homes. How does compassion figure in now? What's a compassionate response?
I think that, at least for me, remembering always that we are called to love our neighbor. And I think that the immigration situation is so interesting and complex because partly it's about borders, right? That are political borders. And there doesn't seem to be the same indication in the biblical text or the Christian tradition that we need to only love those who were within our political community, right? Our within our national borders. And so how can we extend the compassion that we feel to those who are suffering, to any of those suffering people? And then, finding places within our community that are helping immigrants, or looking to organizations that are involved with immigrant justice, or just taking care of immediate needs.
So you've called for courageous compassion as a response to the immigration situation and in response to many issues. What is courageous compassion?
In the article, I describe courageous compassion as a stable habit of responding to the suffering of others thoughtfully and intentionally in order to alleviate their immediate suffering, as well as work to eliminate the causes of that suffering. And I think that it takes courage because that sort of work is scary and often involves confronting power structures that are fairly entrenched. So we can look to the civil rights movement or the apartheid movement to see instances where people have engaged in courageous compassion, right? They saw the suffering of their community and decided to do something about it in a way that requires a significant amount of courage. And not that I think that we're always required to engage in that sort of direct confrontation, but I think that it's valuable to think about how we can do that in small ways in order to maybe work up to some bigger, more scary tasks.
So I think what I'm hearing you say is that we have to respond both on the micro and the macro level.
Right, exactly. Kind of circling back to the particular and the universal, right? That there are particular instances of suffering in our communities that we can respond to by, through kindness and generosity, but also we have a duty to think on that universal scale as well. How are we contributing to the systems of power that are preventing people from flourishing, and what can we do to change those structures?
It's a good challenge as we continue to wrestle with the needs of so many people who are immigrating and migrating all over the world. Mm-hmm. Christine, you write in your essay, compassion draws me to see another's suffering as my own, and courage compels me to be brave enough to confront the causes of that suffering when I am able. Thank you for helping us think more carefully about ways to respond to a challenging issue of human suffering. And would you like to give us a last word?
Sure. I'd love to encourage people that by choosing to act in accordance with our deeply held commitments, we can become people who live with integrity, and people acting with integrity in the pursuit of justice will change the world.
Thank you. Our guest today has been Dr. Christine Darr, Associate Professor of Philosophy, and I'm Annalee Ward for Character Explorations from the Wendt Center for Character Education at the University of Dubuque.